Hi everyone, welcome to ArtsFest Online and to this afternoon's HoPIN webinar, Auto-Chrom and Auto-Lithography, Artists' Printing Processes. Presentations will be from Cătălina Zlotea and Barry McKay. The event will be chaired by Caroline Archer, Co-Director of the Centre for Printed History and Culture. If you have any questions for our speakers, please do use the Q&A box rather than the chat, and we'll go through them at the end of the presentations. And just a bit of housekeeping before we start. We are recording the session and we ask that you not share any sensitive information in the chat or the Q&A. So with all that said, welcome everyone, and over to you, Caroline.
Thank you, Claire, and welcome everyone to HoPIN, or History of the Printed Image Network. HoPIN is brought to you by the Centre for Printing History and Culture in conjunction with ArtsFest at the University of Wolverhampton, who we thank for doing all the techie stuff for us. It's much appreciated. So this evening's webinar welcomes two speakers, each looking at a different printing process used by artists. The first is Auto-Lithography and the second looks at Glacier prints. Before I introduce the speakers, may I just remind you of the format of the event and a few housekeeping rules to bear in mind. I'm going to introduce the speakers both together, and I will then step back and pass the platform over to our presenters. Each speaker is giving a 30-minute illustrated talk, but rather than taking questions at the end of each talk, we'll be taking questions for both speakers at the end of the second talk, so right at the end of presentations. Please can you put your questions in the Q&A box and not the chat. So yeah, just make sure you drop questions in the Q&A and please put them in as you go along, as you think about them. Don't wait right until the end. I will then take the speakers, I'll then take the questions and feed them to the speakers. So no further ado, let me introduce you to our first speaker, who's Cătălina Zlotea. She's a graphic designer with a love for print. She's originally from Romania, but she's also worked in the UK and the Middle East. She's currently a doctoral student in the Department of Typography at the University of Reading. And her research there investigates the life and work of Charles Mozley, who was a 20th century artist, illustrator, printmaker, designer, and one of the leading lithographers of the 1960s. So this evening, Cătălina will present just a slice of her research in a talk entitled Auto-Lithography, a bridge between art and commerce. Our second speaker is Barry McKay. Barry's a bookseller specializing in volumes relating to printing history. He's also a book historian himself, with a particular interest in decorated papers and the history of the book trades in the northern counties of England. His publications include Patterns and Pigments in English Marble Papers, A Pretty Mysterious Art, and an introduction to chapbooks. But his real passion is sheep, and he's currently engaged in writing a history of the Shepherd's Guides of Cumbria. But tonight, Barry is turning his attention to postcards and how these souvenir views were printed. And Barry's talk is entitled Glacier Prints Are Not Photolithographs. So I'll hand over to my speakers now.
Hello. Let me share the screen first. Yes, I hope that's okay for everyone. Thank you, Caroline, for the introduction. I am a PhD student at the University of Reading and the Department of Typography and Graphic Communication. And first, I would like to thank the History of the Printed Image Network for giving me this opportunity to talk about my research. My PhD is supported by the Charles Mozley Trust and investigates the life and work of the artist, illustrator, and printmaker. So Charles Mozley was born in 1914 in Sheffield, where he studied painting and drawing at the Sheffield College of Arts and Crafts. And in 1933, he received a scholarship from the Royal College of Art and moved to London to study painting. Mosley was an extremely prolific artist. Throughout his career, he worked in different mediums and on a variety of projects. He was active both as an artist, exhibiting in solo and group exhibitions, and as a freelance commercial artist with many commissions from London Transport, Shell and BP, the advertising agency, Coleman, Prentice and Varley, theatre and film production companies, as well as from the majority of publishers in the UK. Mosley always considered himself an artist who needed to take on commercial commissions in order to make a living and support his family. He would have potentially rejected the other designations that I used to describe him, illustrator and printmaker, or at least he would not have seen these activities as separate from art. I believe that Mosley was closely aligned with Barnett Friedman, one of the most commended lithographers of the time, who said to his students, "What do you mean by commercial art? There is only good and bad art." And also with Toulouse-Lautrec, one of Mosley's role models, also a famous name in the world of lithography, who is said to also have refused to recognize this distinction between fine and commercial art. As I already mentioned, it is extremely difficult to pigeonhole a prolific image maker like Mosley. There is much to say about him as a painter of oils and watercolors, as a book illustrator, as a poster designer, or as an illustrator of advertisements and ephemera. However, my presentation today will focus on his practice as an autolithographer, a term he used, and on the printing process for which he strongly advocated, both as a medium of artistic expression in the manner of the French post-impressionists, and as the optimal medium of reproducing an artist's work for commercial purposes. In a letter to the Limited Editions Club of New York, Mosley declared that, "I believe that the French approach to autolithography was the right one, and I have preached this ever since." The invention of lithography, the method of printing from a limestone block discovered in 1798 by Alois Sennefelder, was actually not connected in any way with the art world. And it was later, in the early years of the 19th century, that artists realized that the newly invented process could capture and transfer their touch onto paper, and allow for an intimate relationship between the hand of the artist and the finished product. Whereas the engraver had to learn a craft, cutting into a block of wood or a sheet of metal, lithography, the argument went, only required artists to do what came naturally, to draw. In England, however, by the 1850s, the practice of lithography became further and further removed from the art world and was primarily a commercial medium. And even though there had been preliminary efforts in the last years of the 19th century, the revival of lithography as a medium of artistic expression was not achieved at a consistent level in England until the first decade of the 20th century, with the formation of the Sennefelder Club in 1909. The undertaking of the club was to rehabilitate the relationship between art and lithography, and especially color lithography, as an artistic medium, since in the last half of the 19th century, as I mentioned, the process had fallen into disrepute, mainly being associated with mass-produced, vulgar and low-quality advertisements and ephemera. On top of that, those advancing the principles of the arts and crafts movement also rejected lithography as an example of the separation between the designer or artist and the maker, the chromolithographer or copyist, so the person responsible for translating the image onto the printing surface. So in order to distance themselves from what was perceived as menial commercial practice, the members of the Sennefelder Club adopted the term autolithography, which was first used in the magazine The Studio in 1893, and later became more and more popular in Britain in the 1930s, 1940s, and 1950s. Okay, my slides jumped a bit. From the 1940s and into the 1960s, Mosley exhibited lithographs printed in small runs and group exhibitions that advanced lithography as fine art and viewed the works exhibited as fine prints. So these were works that reflected Mosley's activity as an artist and are to be regarded to some extent as separate from his practice as an autolithographer for commercial commissions. Nevertheless, Mosley was arguably a reputable artist printmaker of his time, as Peter Flau, the keeper of the circulation department at the V&A, remarked in 1950 in an article published in the Studio, when he said that, and I quote, Mosley's best lithographs, like the recent as yet unpublished Cambridge Circus, which is shown here on the left-hand page, are brilliantly successful and display a technical virtuosity and originality not equaled by any of his British contemporaries. And this is a poster for an exhibition on the history of lithography organized by the V&A in 1948. That was potentially commissioned by Peter Flau, who, as I quoted before, had expressed his admiration for Mosley's mastery of lithography. The poster was printed in 4 colors by Vincent Brooks Day and Son, one of the best lithographic printers at the time in Britain. And the prints collection at the V&A holds a copy of the poster, as well as the progressive proofs, which appear to have also been exhibited. So it is possible that the poster had been planned as part of the exhibition, as an example meant to explain the process, and not necessarily as a promotional piece intended for wider dissemination. So this poster is perhaps somewhere in between a commercial commission and an artistic lithograph. So besides reviving lithography as an artistic medium, the idea of the collaboration of artists with the lithographic trade in Britain between the 2 world wars was also an attempt to combine the tradition of 19th century autography with modern methods of mass production, as well as a reflection of the left-wing sentiment of the interwar years, advocating an almost utopian democratization of art. This was therefore a fertile ground for a different kind of revival of the colored lithograph, different from the Sennefelder's Club Manifesto that advocated for limited print runs and aimed to elevate the process's status to that of fine art. So starting from the 1930s, the promoters of autolithography regarded this printing process as means of making art accessible to everyone, and also as a method of reconciling the crass world of advertising with the genteel tutelage of the masses, as well as the patronage of artists. This became the backdrop for a number of lithographic print schemes, starting with Piper's and Wellington's contemporary lithographs, Artists International Association Everyman Print, Brenda Rounsley's The School Prints, the Festival of Britain series, the RCA's Coronation series, as well as 2 corporate-sponsored series by Lyons and Guinness. The concept of these schemes was expanded on the ethos of commercial bodies like the Empire Marketing Board and the Post Office, run by Stephen Tallents, Frank Pick's London Transport, and Jack Beddington's Shell Mex. These organizations had fully exploited the poster as a means for advertising products and services, and as a way of exposing the everyday man to the works of modern artists in an attempt to erode the class distinction between fine and commercial art. Whereas London Transport, Shell, and the Post Office claimed that their advertising campaigns brought contemporary art out of the galleries and made it available for the general public to see and enjoy, Most of the print series asserted that their prints were not only a way of exposing a lay audience to art, but also a way for the common man to own original works of art. In their promotion, most of these schemes highlighted the fact that the prints were original works of art by contemporary, renowned, or promising artists. And because they were printed in large numbers, they could be sold at very low prices. Mosley took part in the school print series, the Lions lithographs, and the Coronation lithograph series printed at the Royal College of Art. The school prints was a project started by Derek Rawnsley in 1939 that offered reproductions of famous works of art for schools to hire. The story behind the school prints is quite extraordinary. It is a love story that ended tragically and that prompted Brenda Rawnsley, Derek's wife, to continue her husband's project. However, Brenda's aim was to produce a series of original lithographs, 4 for each school term, to be purchased by schools rather than hired. And they're displayed in classrooms as a means of giving young children an understanding of contemporary art. By keeping the price as low as possible, the school prints intended to bring the scheme within the reach of all education authorities. Even though the artists were asked to supply roughs for consideration by a council led by the art critic Herbert Reed, they had the freedom of choice for their subject matter. And also due to the austerity measures and restrictions of the post-war era, picture frames were scarce, and so the lithographs often needed to be pasted straight onto the walls. And this is the reason why most of the pictures feature a tent at trompe-l'œil with these borders that mimic frames. Most of the images published in the first series in 1946 showed jolly depictions of the English countryside and townscape, which struck a chord in that immediate post-war period, and they actually sold over 3,000 copies. Now, whereas most artists depicted scenes that would have been familiar to children, like horses, tractors, urban and rural scenes, or vases with flowers, Mosley's choice of subject for his lithograph, titled The Ballet, which was number 10 out of 12 lithographs in the first series, is perhaps a little unusual, since it is unlikely that a ballet scene would have been in the visual repertoire of any school child, especially in 1946. The pictures were printed by the Barnyard Press, and it seems that there were a few recorded problems with the reproduction of the lithographs. One example is actually Mosley's The Ballet. And it seems that the advisory council were irritated by the fact that Mosley, after having his sketch accepted, went and changed both the composition and the color in making his lithograph. And as far as I know, Mosley also wasn't too keen on the result, and perhaps this is the reason why he didn't take part in the second series of the school prints. Another lithographic scheme that Mosley was part of was an initiative by J. Lyons & Co., managed by Julian and Felix Salmon, that had been conceived in the late 40s and early 50s, primarily as a practical means of refurbishing their restaurants and cafes in a time of rationing, as well as a public relation exercise, an attempt to associate the name of Lyons with good art. Besides decorating the walls of tea shops and restaurants, copies of the prints were also made available to the public at low prices within the reach of most patrons. The scheme was divided into 3 series published in 1947, 1951, and 1955. The creative team behind the project was comprised of Jack Beddington. He was the project manager, who was known for commissioning artists for his shell campaigns and therefore was responsible for selecting the artists. Barnett Friedman, who was an artist well-versed in commercial print production, and therefore the bridge between artist and the printer, and Frank Oppenheimer, which was the managing director of ChromoWorks, the company that printed the lithographs. The first series, published in 1947, included many of the artists also involved with the school print. 16 prints were produced, size a quad crown, so that's 30 by 40 inch, and up to 7 colors, printed offset from zinc plates, which meant that those artists who drew directly onto the plates were able to do so in their own homes. However, not all artists were necessarily comfortable with lithography, a medium many did not have the patience or necessary skill to tackle. So therefore, in the first series, 9 out of 16 artists actually submitted paintings and relied on the technicians working at ChromoWorks to translate their artworks into lithographs. Some of the artists who accepted the challenge of autolithography were Edward Ardizone, Edward Boden, Anthony Gross, Edwin Liddell, and John Nash. Mosley was not part of the first series, but contributed to the second one in 1951 with this lithograph titled Henley. In order to reduce the production cost, Beddington and Friedman decided to either select artists who were comfortable with lithography or to encourage others to try their hand at the process. They believed that those who did not have as much experience producing lithographs had found the large format of the first series intimidating. So in this time, 12 landscape posters were produced, 6 of them the same size as the one in the first series, and 6 smaller formats of 20 by 30 inch. Even so, in the second series, only 7 out of 12 prints were auto-lithographed. So all of the 6 large format by Charles Mozley, Robin Darwin, Barnett Friedman, Anthony Gross, Edwin Liddell, and Robert Scanlon, and one of the small formats by Linton Lamb. Since the second series of Lyons lithographs coincided with the Festival of Britain, Beddington suggested that artists follow a theme highlighting British scenes and the British way of life. Henley is a typical reflection of the theme, as well as of Mosley's style, showing his confident use of rich colors, the splattered texture, and unconstrained composition. I think that the way in which he managed to describe the characters and their surroundings so distinctly, and at the same time, apparently with little effort or restraint, proves that he was in absolute control of the technique and of the way in which the colors reacted whenever overprinted. It is this spontaneous feeling that brings a lot of tension to an otherwise static composition. It is as if the image came together by chance and the colors just happened to mix in a favorable way. And in fact, Oppenheimer had expressed concerns in a letter to Friedman about the pools of Henley and recommended that it should be reprinted. Even though he said that he liked the lithograph, he felt that the distortion of the figures was too obvious and was concerned that this could be perceived as an error made by ChromoWorks rather than a deliberate stylistic feature. The third and final Lyons series was published in 1955. 12 large format landscape lithographs were printed, out of which 8 were autolithographs, including Mosley's children's music. The image features Mosley's 3 daughters during a performance in an indoor setting, perhaps in the family home. And the colors in this case are a bit bolder and more saturated than in Henley, but overall the composition has a similar spontaneous and whimsical tone. And on the left, I hope you can see the picture at different stages of printing and perhaps notice how the colors respond when they are overprinted. And I find it interesting that the proof numbered 4 is darker overall, but also the girl in the foreground has somehow stronger features, and to a certain extent that one looks more finished than the final version. But also these pulls show the way in which the picture came together by constantly changing the drawing on the plates until the artist was pleased with the result. David Gentleman, who participated in this 3rd series, remembered that when the lion lithographs were printed, there was no separate proofing process. And I quote, as soon as you thought you'd probably got each color right, the whole edition of 1500 was run off. So besides producing and exhibiting hand-printed small edition lithographs and taking part in these commercial print schemes, Mosley also auto-lithographed film and theater posters, programs for the City Music Society, illustrations for books, and ephemera for the wine trade. In 1947, Mosley started to produce a series of lithographic posters for H.M. Tennant, the leading London theatrical producers. These are auto-lithographs, which he did every weekend for all their productions at the Lyric Theatre or the Globe. He made these posters more for love than for money, as he put it. Kitty Black, who worked for the Tennant theatrical agents in the 30s and 40s, recalled in her autobiography an episode when Mosley had agreed to produce a poster for Crime Passionnel. His stipulation was that he would never submit a design for approval. However, he did promise that he would not use more than 2 colors to keep the cost down. So he was given the layout for the names and a rough outline of the plot, and went ahead and drew directly onto the printing plates. However, not showing the proofs to anyone led to an embarrassing mistake. The word passionnel missed one of the ends, and it was only when the play was transferred to the West End and Mosley had to change one of the actors' names that he was able to correct the poster and put in the second end. So on the left is the poster with the spelling mistake, and on the right is the correct spelling. But perhaps the most exciting items we have uncovered so far in the Mosley archive are these multi-sheet billboard posters that, when assembled, measure about 12 meters by 3 meters. Mosley did these for the films Another Shore in 1948, An Ideal Husband produced by Alexander Korda in 1947, and The Queen of Spades in 1949. We are absolutely thrilled when we found them, because these sort of billboard posters are very unlikely to have survived. As far as I know, the BFI holds several such sets, not all of them complete, dating from the late 1930s through the 1940s. But what is really outstanding is the fact that it appears that Mosley actually auto-lithographed some, if not all, of these billboards. Because he said, and I quote him here, believing that posters should be auto-lithographs, I did quite a lot of posters for Alexander Korda for his films. I am probably the only living artist in this country who has auto-lithographed a 40-sheet poster composed of 12 sheets. The matching was a bit difficult. So besides the poster in the BFI archive, the V&A also holds a full set in very good condition of this version of An Ideal Husband. And what makes me think that this is the billboard Mosley referred to in his letter is that it was probably Mosley himself who donated the set to the V&A, perhaps because he was aware of the fact that these multi-sheet posters were unlikely to be kept or collected, and wanted to make sure that his contribution to the history of the poster, so this gigantic autolithograph, will be recorded and remembered in the future. And this is how these billboards would have been displayed in London in the late 40s. And in fact, on the right side of the image where the arrow is pointing, you can discern part of Mosley's poster for An Ideal Husband, the black and yellow version. Even when he took on tasks in illustration and advertising, which artists in general would have considered minor or menial, Mosley insisted that his contribution ought to be more than just producing a drawing or painting for reproduction. He wanted to make the image directly in the language of the process used for its multiplication, in the manner of an original print. He believed that posters should be autolithographs and that the printing should be done under the artist's direct supervision. When he did not have access to a printing press, he would print autolithographs with an ordinary household mangle instead of a press. He always drew on zinc plates instead of stone, and he made his position clear. I believe that a printing machine is part of an artist's palette just as much as his colors, and that he should be allowed to play his tune just as much as Schweitzer is allowed to play his on all of the finest organs of Europe. The revival of color lithography in Britain in the first half of the 20th century, described as autolithography, had two distinct incentives and desired outcomes. The first was the initiative of the Sennefelder Club, which was founded specifically to promote artistic lithography. Their prints were limited editions, often limited to fewer than 25 impressions, and this was made clear in the exhibition catalogs. Their goal was for lithography to be regarded as a medium for fine art. The interwar years, however, witnessed another kind of revival of lithography as more than a process, as a craft, a democratic activity, and also as a political activity meant to celebrate the partnership between artists and printer and for the benefit of the general public. As James Fitton, the lithographer and founding member of the Artists International Association, put it, everyone was to the left in those days. What else was there? I don't believe that Mosley's proclivity for lithography was necessarily driven by his political views. However, I'm quite certain that the creed of the Sennefelder Club rang true to him, given his admiration for 19th century post-impressionism. Moreover, I believe that for Mosley, autolithography was also represented a medium that reconciled his selfhood as an artist with the necessity of taking on commercial commissions, a bridge between art and commerce. Thank you. This is it from me.
Want me to go?
Yep.
Share screen, don't I?
Yeah.
There we go. There we go. Allegedly.
We can't see it yet, Barry.
No,
Oh, there you go.
got it there now?
Yes, perfect.
Good, good. Get me out of the way there, then I can see what I'm looking at. Bit of an act to follow there. Thanks very much indeed, Cătălina. That was a lovely talk. Right, Glacier prints are not photolithographs. From the middle of the 18th century, the landscape of the north of England became better known to the upper and middle classes of this country, who previously were perhaps more familiar with the continent. But through the medium of the printed image, the attractions of the region began to enter the consciousness of those who could and increasingly did venture into the area, and particularly into the Lake counties of Cumberland, Westmoreland, and Lancashire north of the Sands, now Cumbria. Over the following decades, a growing number of publications drew attention to the region. A body of literature that, as it seems reasonable to state, began with John Brown's posthumously published A Description of the Lake at Keswick, which ran to several editions between 1767, and 1772, having first appeared in a letter printed in the London Chronicle. Joseph Farrington, Thomas Girton, J.M.W. Turner, and others, who included the local William Green, were among the artists to exhibit the region's natural beauty. Later, mainly in the first half of the century, a number of publications were to be issued that included steel engravings of local beauty spots, all of which did much to encourage visitors. Oh, this project thing. Where's the thing to move it on?
You should be able to
yeah,
use your
sorry,
arrow.
it's
Yeah,
too
there you go.
light. It's too light. I couldn't see. Pause for thought in the future. The beautiful graphic process that is aquatint engraving is almost synonymous with the publisher Rudolf Ackermann, who published a picturesque tour of the English lakes in 1821 with hand-coloured aquatints after Theodore Fielding and John Walton. In this image, Fielding has presented what the viewer might hope to see rather than an accurate prospect, for there is no large body of water here between St John's in the Vale and the Skidar and Saddleback range. The manner of presenting such images and any accompanying text is by and large in quarto or folio volumes, intended more for the gentleman's library than as a readily portable guide to the region. Doubtless they will also have served as an incitement to visit or as an aid memoir of such a visit, but I feel it fair not to regard them as souvenirs in the way we would use the term today. From the 1850s, sorry, I've got a cold. In the 1850s, the firm of Nelson began issuing the occasional title with tinted lithograph illustrations, and by 1860 had become the leading publishers of colour printed books for the cheaper end of the tourist market. Nelson issued their first collection of views in the Lake District in 1856, and by 1859 had published 3 more devoted to the region, including the English lakes in the neighbourhood of Ambleside, and this illustration shown there is from the 1870 reprint. Several of the images were reused in 2 or more of these titles. Furthermore, they were issued in a variety of states, including small oblong folio, in portrait format, or loose in open-ended sleeves, all with greater or lesser amounts of accompanying text. These cheerful publications were sold cheaply and were undeniably aimed at and affordable by the growing market of mass tourism. Several factors led to this growth of tourism to the lakes. The increasing allowance of holidays to working people, allied to the arrival of the railway, which by the 1870s had been laid round most of the perimeter of the Lake District. All the processes employed in producing the images mentioned so far are essentially autographic, dependent on the skill of the artist and craftsman to record the view with a greater or lesser degree of accuracy. And this was about change. Louis Glacier, who flourished from 1868 till about 1910 from a large factory in Leipzig, employed a variety of autographic and mechanical processes to become a major producer of graphic images, not least albums of views of beauty spots. Glacier seems to have developed his process, perhaps with Charles Frey of Frankfurt am Main in the 1870s. These Glacier process prints are frequently described as photolithographs. Indeed, Philip Frey, who himself produced many such albums, does refer to the process as photolithography. The images are reproduced photographically onto a litho stone, which has received a photosensitive coating of some silver process. After exposure, and with the image visible on the stone as a non-printing picture, the lithographer has just to follow the image you could see with lithographic drawing ink. It is, in other words, the skill of the draftsman on which the quality of the final result depends. When done well, it is a marvelous process with astonishing effects, not least because of several stones were used, not for different colors, but for different tonalities, with the finished image enhanced by varnishing the entire page. Glacier had a large business, and although perhaps more famed for the production of postcards, he is reputed to have supplied some 300 souvenir albums in Leporello design to 128 publishers in Europe and elsewhere. Although perhaps dating to the 1880s, this example, published by Glacier himself, is of an album von Berlin. Furthermore, it carries his imprint on the tail of one leaf. This album is typical of most that I've seen, that is presented in an accordion or concertina style, extending to 1.36 meters and carrying 26 images, printed for the most part 2 to the page on 12 leaves. I fear my ability in interpreting information from German library catalogues or archival sources is somewhat limited. Thus, I've been unable to establish what, if any, was the relationship between Charles, Auguste, and Philip Frey, beyond the fact that their imprints appear on a number of these publications. It is, however, noticeable that a number of such albums on American themes carry an imprint reading Portland, published by Chisholm Brothers, sole agent for Frey Original Souvenirs. To whom credit for the origination of the process truly belongs, I remain uncertain. A situation not helped by a colophon leaf, I use the word advisedly, laid down inside the rear cover of Le Beau du Rhin, in which Philip claimed to be the, and forgive my German pronunciation, Urheber der lithographischen Fotografie Druck, which, if my understanding is accurate, suggests he is claiming to be the author, i.e. inventor, of the lithographic photographic print. This souvenir album, the Souvenir de Pèlerinage de Saint-Anne d'Auray, carries the imprint of another Frey, this time Auguste Frey of Frankfurt am Main, and states the process to be photolithography. A number of London-based firms published a wide variety of these albums, which have a number of common themes. They are all in Leporello form and contain a number of Glacier process prints. They are usually attractively presented in ornately gold blocked covers, are either in portrait format of around 220 to 200 by 165 millimeters or a little larger, or small landscape format of about 85 by 130 millimeters. And finally, they almost invariably carry a block stamp on the covers stating that they were printed in Germany or occasionally printed abroad. Perhaps the first in the field was that of Joseph Levy, a wholesale comb manufacturer and importer of beads who traded at 66 Leadenhall Street from at least 1866 until 1878, by which year the firm was styled Joseph Levy and Sons and had added the importation of children's toys to their stock in trade, as well as being publishers of the memento albums of views. The colophon on the rear page down of this copy of 24 Views of the English Lakes notes that the photographs were transferred to stone by a new process, rendering them permanent. With 12 leaves extending to 1.3 meters, it carries 24 small images, each printed 2 to the leaf. Levy's claim to be publishers of the memento albums is reinforced in this copy of the memento album of Keswick District, which unusually in my experience is more ornately presented, being bound in tortoiseshell pattern marble paper and housed in a slipcase. The volume also includes 2 images rarely found among the usual suspects of Lake District views. An image of Castlereagh Stone Circle, which predates Stonehenge by a millennium or so, and here falls into the usual Victorian error of thinking, if it isn't Roman, it must be Druidic. There is also a view of Wastwater, the most dramatic lake in the district, but some distance from Keswick, requiring a stiff climb over the high Styhead Pass from the Borrowdale Valley. The only firm among the English publishers of these albums who is core book trade connections was that of William Frederick Rock. Born in Barnstable in 1801, he was originally a banker in his native town before moving to London to work with Thomas de la Rue. From 1821 to 3, he traded as De La Rue, Rock & Co. before he began trading under his own name. From 1844 until 1855, the firm traded as Rock Brothers and Payne, during which time they claimed to be the publishers of 5,500 in 1866, 6,000 in 1870, and finally 7,000 in 1878 views of England and Wales. In 1884, Rock retired and the firm was sold to John Dickinson, but continued trading until after the turn of the century as Rock Brothers. An online search of Library Hub and other sources consulted resulted in 16 such albums, several of which are styled royal or cabinet albums. One such of the former was Rock's Royal Llangollen, Corwin and Bala cabinet album, published between 1884 and 95. And the contents include this fine view of the bridge of Llangollen, or Llangollen as it was recently pronounced on the Home Service. The album included a fine dramatic view of the Abbey and Lake at Valley Crucis, and what is a less than flattering portrait of the ladies of Llangollen, an image which is clearly from an engraving rather than a photograph from life, as the last of the ladies died in 1831. The word royal is also found used by a firm that styles itself merely as E&S, and which is in all probability that of Eyre and Spottiswoode. The Royal Album of London Views, which was published by E&S, Library Hub reveals several other titles with this print, or with an attribution to Eyre and Spottiswoode, which includes Imperial, Century, and Royal Albums of London, as well as 2 unrivaled albums of permanent views of Middlesbrough and Darlington. The London album is unusual in having a map of the central city with an index of streets. It extends to 2.8 meters and carries 21 images on 18 leaves, including 1 panorama of the north bank of the River Thames, which occupies the top half of 6 leaves. The image of the Imperial Institute, which was established in 1887, would suggest it dates to a little later than that year. E&S, or Eyre and Spottiswoode, also published at least one other royal album, that of Morecambe and Lancaster. Like the London album, it was printed in Germany, and in this instance extends to 1.7 meters, with 9 leaves carrying 21 images. And in almost each example, credit is given to the photographer, mainly the national firms of Thrift or Valentine. One of the photographs, however, is credited to A. Edwards, perhaps a local photographer, and shows the pavilion at the end of the pier, which will date this volume to about 1898 or shortly thereafter. Staying with the theme of seaside resorts on the North Lancashire coast, we have the album of Blackpool Views, published by WMZ, who may well be the firm of William Zimmerman, who between 1860 and 1900 traded originally as importers of toys and later adding fancy goods and Birmingham and Sheffield wares to their offerings. They published this album of Blackpool Views with 15 images on 12 leaves, which extends to 1.6 meters. I find it difficult to reconcile the elegance of the pedestrians in this view of Talbot Square with present-day visitors to the town, but perhaps I'm just being snobbish. Like many of these publications, this volume includes a panoramic view, which does not show the eponymous tower, construction of which began in 1891. And as there is no indication of the tower being under erection, the volume must date to the late 1880s or perhaps as late as 1890 to 91. It is difficult to believe it would have otherwise been ignored. The same imprint is found on an album of views of Hastings and St. Leonard's, which carries an advert for a local toy and fancy warehouse on the rear paste down end leaf. Further evidence that these products appealed largely to the fancy goods trade rather than the core book trade. Like so many of the publishers included in the essay, the firm published an album of essays of Lake's Views, again printed in Germany. The volume contains many of the usual suspects, including this dramatic view of Lodore Falls. It also includes a splendid landscape view of Rydal Village, including Wordsworth House, These days, of course, such an album would include Beatrix Potter's house at Hilltop Soary, probably with an insert of a rabbit. The album also contains a splendid bird's eye view of Keswick and Derwentwater. The viewpoint for such images such as this presents little difficulty in the Lake District, as we have plenty of fells overlooking fells from which such photographs could be taken. It has been suggested that such bird's eye views were sometimes taken from hot air balloons. Charles Reynolds and Co., and that's Charles, Reynolds and Co., appear to be one of, if not the largest publisher of these albums. I've so far identified 115 albums advertised by the firm, of which copies of 56 have been located via Library Hub and other online sources. The firm are recorded as stationers in 1866, operating from 26 Milk Street. Thereafter, they are advertised as foreign importers and wholesale stationers. I've so far seen 3 different regularly used front cover designs on their publications. The one on the right being the most common. Its design allows for the easy insertion of the subject area in the diagonal band. As with the covers, I've seen 3 variations of advertisements laid down as the rear page down end leaf. They were at 26 and 27 Milk Street from 1885 until 1888. There are no entries for them in the Post Office London directory for the 25 to 27 Milk Street addresses, and by 1889 they were at 72 and 73 4th Street and 18 and 20 4th Street Avenue, where they were last recorded in 1895. These advertisements reveal the large number of volumes they published and includes a volume of Uitenhage in South Africa, a volume I've been unable to locate anywhere. In 1886, Lewis's department store of Liverpool published an album of 13 views to commemorate an international exhibition held in the city. At around the same time, Charles Reynolds and Co., perhaps capitalizing on the exhibition, also published an album entitled Exhibition Album of Liverpool and New Brighton Views. The volume extends to 1.64 meters with 12 leaves carrying 18 images. While several of the images in this album are to be found in the Lewis's volume, they are all taken from slightly different viewpoints. The firm also published an album of English Lakes views, probably in the late 1880s or early 1890s, with a 3rd cover design from the same address and carrying the 4th Street page down advert. To my mind, one of the finest images of the volume is this landscape view of Grasmere, complete with elegantly clad picnickers down in the bottom left-hand corner there. This detail from their view of Thirlmere gives an indication of the various textures and tonalities that could be achieved in this process by skilled lithographic draftsmen and printers. A keyword search of the word leporello in the hope of finding advertisements for these publications via the British Library newspaper's website threw up so many reports of interpreters of the role of Don Giovanni's servant in Mozart's opera that I lost the will to live. However, it did reveal a Cumbrian advert in the pages of the Cumberland and Westmoreland Herald for just such a view book, published by Thomas Hodgson in Penrith. The advert appeared with some frequency between November 1874 and November 1883. Such a long series of appearances does rather suggest that the book did in fact appear, although no copy has ever come to light. And although some of the places mentioned appear in other Lake District volumes, none of the other publishers felt the need to include a portrait of the chairman of the local Board of Health. The only other contemporary instance I found of the use of the word leporello to describe these volumes is the Leporello album of the Isle of Man, which the original owner noted the purchase date of 1883. An album of Penrith and Ullswater views did appear, but from the firm of Charles Reynolds & Co. from their 4th Street address, and however it does not appear in the list of the publications from either the Milk Street or 4th Street addresses. It extends to 1.7 meters with 26 images on only 12 leaves. One double-page view shows this fine townscape of the gateway to the North Lakes. This does present an indication of the dangers of attempting to date these albums from the contents of the images, as I would expect the town to have extended up the hill in this area here by that time. Furthermore, it seems to me that there is no suitable high point to obtain such a view, so it may have been taken from a balloon. There can, however, be no doubt about the view of Devonshire Street, the town's major thoroughfare. This also shows, to my mind, a frequent fault with this process. While the land or townscapes must be regarded as accurate, one can hardly say the same for human figures, a number of which are shown here, and which appear to be almost cardboard cutout figures. But oh, what elegant citizens Penrith appears to have had. All the albums so far discussed have been published by London firms. Some, it is true, have been seen with local outlets advertised on the rear paste downs, but there were some local publishers who took an entrepreneurial role in the production of these souvenir albums. One such was J. Wood and Co. of Silloth, who published a souvenir album of Silloth from the town's largest department store, an establishment which features prominently on the slide on the bottom right-hand corner. Extending to a little over 1.3 meters with 27 small images on 12 leaves, the album was clearly aimed at the genteel visitor the town sought to attract, as after their images, there are 6 pages extolling the delights of this North Cumbria watering place and the better quality local hotels. It probably dates from the 1890s. There are no less than 4 images of the delights of the Marine Hotel at Skinburness, just up the coast from Silloth. The hotel was the establishment's most prominent building and has since been demolished, evidence perhaps of the value of these publications towards the architectural history of a place. The number of the images of the hotel does rather make me wonder if the establishment had a financial interest in the publication. Another town on the fringes of the district to be the subject of such an album was Barrow in Furness. Indeed, it ran to 2 such. The first was published by Joseph Brooks Sansom, a bookseller and stationer who is known to have traded in the town between 1871 and 1892. The volume includes several views of the ruins of the Cistercian Abbey of Furness, housed in the romantic Vale of Deadly Nightshade, just outside the town. The viewpoint for the panoramic view is clearly taken from the conveniently situated hill overlooking the abbey. The other example for Barrow was published by Henry Jeevons, another bookseller and stationer who was active in the town from 1882 until the early 20th century. I cannot help but wonder if the J.B. Sansom of the Waverley Temperance Hotel is the same man we have just met as a bookseller and stationer. The hotel was renamed in the Duke of Edinburgh and has not many claims to fame, but I did take my first legal pint of beer in it there. The view of the town's attractions, and if you've been to Barrow, you'll know I use the word advisedly, other than Furness Abbey, include the flaxworks and the hematite and steelworks, but less prosaically, a fine view of the ferry across to Walney Island before the high-level bridge was built. As usual, elegant figures adorn the view. Nowhere in these albums are there any representations of what one may term the lower orders. The Liverpool firm of Brown and Rawcliffe, established in 1877, also produced a number of albums in their camera series, which eventually extended to at least 40 such volumes. They issued at least 3 variant editions of their camera series of albums of photolithographic views of the lakes. This edition boasts a restricted number of other volumes listed on the rear paste down advert. It does, however, list a local agent who has proved impossible to locate in any of the limited number of local directories for the period under review. Furthermore, there is no mention of the gold medal they were awarded in the 1886 International Exhibition. So perhaps this edition predates 1886. Also, the images are of a distinctly grey tone rather than the usual brown. Another edition of the same title from Brown and Roth does acknowledge the receipt of their gold medal and lists a larger number of volumes in the series and therefore must date to after 1886. But once again, it is of a decidedly grey tone, one of which is this fine view of Derwentwater. Finally, the rear paste down advert claims that the volume is designed, manufactured and published by the company in Liverpool. This other edition presents difficulties in what might otherwise have been a pleasingly obvious sequence. There is no claim to the 1888 gold medal. A similarly short list of other volumes is present as in the first of the three. There is no indication of place of manufacture and only the statement on the front cover, entered at Stationers' Hall. And it is printed in brown tones and is varnished. Furthermore, and confusingly, elsewhere in the volume is a small inset image, clearly captioned, skating in Windermere during the frost of 1895. It must therefore postdate that. Although Fox Talbot is credited with the idea of the halftone process for reproducing photographs as early as 1852, it was 1869 before Frederick Ives produced the first truly successful method. Further refinements improved the process, and so by the 1890s it was coming into regular use. Thereafter, such albums were illustrated with half-tone photographs, undeniably accurate and usually bereft of human figures. But to me, they lack the charm and dramatic visual appeal of their Glacier forerunners. These prints, be they invented by Glacier or Frey, I have seen variously described as photographs, which strictly speaking, they are not. Lithographs, again, and strictly speaking, they are not, as there has been autographic intervention. Or even Woodbury types, which they most decidedly are not, although they do share some of the depth of tonal value associated with that process. It seems to me that they hold a worthy place between the chromolithographs, where a lithographic draftsman has copied or even interpreted an artist's work on stone, and the halftone, where only a screen separates the original photograph from the printable image. I hope I've shown that they deserve respect in their own right and are undeniably worthy of further investigation. 2 days ago, my attention was drawn to a collection of 80 such albums at Kyoto University, including 29 from the United Kingdom. The contents of each album is presented online, so you can browse through them to your heart's content. I commend it to you. Thank you for your time.
Well, thank you both. Can I bring Cătălina back into the frame? Thank you both for your very excellent talks, which I think were both curiously complementary but equally divergent. Both were about processes, but the examples you showed were wholly different results in terms of style and scale and purpose. And I suspect you took very different approaches to your research methods and dealt with very different types of resources when putting your talks together, but perhaps we can touch on that in the questions a little bit later. We have a question. So the first question is for Cătălina, and it comes from Nicholas Birchall. So Nicholas is asking, how different is the drawing process between a lithostone and a zinc plate?
Well, the main difference is that on a zinc plate you can't really see very well what you're doing because of the color, whereas on a stone it's white, so the pencil leaves a very contrasting mark. So that's one of the main differences. In terms of effects or things that you can and cannot do, there isn't much difference. On the zinc, for example, you can't scratch out like you do on stone, or you can, but then it wouldn't print as well. And obviously with the zinc plate, the artist is not confined to the printing studio because they can take it home with them and also not run into any trouble with the printing unions, which in Britain were a problem and at the time that I'm looking at.
So Cătălina, I imagine the first slide you showed with the hand working the stone, that was you?
No,
That's not you?
No,
Okay.
it's a artist lithographer, contemporary artist lithographer,
Okay.
demonstrating the process. I know, I wish it were me. I did do lithography here in the department. I was lucky enough to have Michael Twyman show me how to do it, but simply as a way for me to understand how the process works and the chemistry behind it.
Yeah. And how important do you think that having had some hands-on experience of the process, how important do you feel that is for you to be able to interpret your research?
There are aspects and details when looking at lithographic prints that for me were quite abstract. For example, the use of gum arabic in order to block out ink. There were things that I could, and I read about, people describe these processes, but maybe it's me not being very technically inclined. I had to actually do it myself. The same to see how the splatter effect was obtained. It sounds really logic that he would use a toothbrush to do the splatter, but in terms of density and sizes and how you would control that, I think, for me, it was very useful to actually do it myself.
Yeah, sure. I'm looking at the Q&A box and I'm waiting for people. I think everyone's being very shy at the moment with their questions. So
No, we've both made it perfectly clear.
Cătălina, sorry, again, Cătălina, can you tell me a little bit about the archive? I've not heard of the Mosley archive before. It'd be useful to know what it contains, how it was put together.
Well, the archive was brought to Reading in 2018. It was with the formation of the Charles Mozley Trust that this came to happen. It's uncatalogued, so while I'm researching, there is my colleague Sally Morris is cataloging the archive. I think it's unusual because everything is sort of unsorted and not touched since Mosley passed away in 91. And a lot of it gives the feeling that it was sort of left in a studio and it wasn't in any way meant for people to research it, which on the one hand is very challenging because we are still in the process. So I haven't had the chance to see everything yet. So it is challenging and it can be really overwhelming, but it's also very exciting to tackle something that no one's looked at before. So that's why we were extremely excited when we found those billboards, because every time you open a box, you don't know what you're going to find there. So it's still in process. There's a lot of work because Mosley worked a lot. He produced so much, and he was very fast when he was drawing, and and that's what he did all day long. I've seen some photographs from a birthday party, and even in those photographs, he's seen sitting at a table and probably drawing someone's portrait on a tissue or something. So there's a lot.
So Mosley didn't consciously put this together as a collection. This is literally his studio, and he passes away, and it's then gathered and donated.
He used to live in this really big, imposing house in Richmond, and one of his daughters has a house nearby. So both of these houses were packed with, starting from oil paintings and watercolors, and so the basically fine art aspect of his work. but then everything that he did for his commercial commissions, sometimes there's proofs, maquettes, roughs.
Mm.
So yeah.
Great, fantastic to have that to work with.
Yeah.
There's a question in the Q&A from Julie Melby, this time for Barry. Could I ask Barry about the 3 volumes with different covers? Can you tell differences in the, sorry, I need to put my glasses on. Can you tell differences in the plates, or are the prints exactly the same?
Hi, Julie. Thanks for your question. The prints inside are the same. They're all the same process. I'm not yet happy in my own mind if there's any chronological sequence to the use of these covers, but the most common one I've seen so far is the 3rd one I showed, with the title in the at a diagonal stroke, and also they tended to be from the later addresses, but I'm not completely definite about that yet. They're also slightly larger than the other ones.
Barry, I might have missed this. How much did these things sell for?
A shilling, 1 6pence. And I noticed somebody asked, I think through the chat, because they couldn't get through the question and answer, about booksellers selling them, I think. Can you get it up?
Oh yeah, question for Barry. Were those albums only sold by booksellers, or were there other ways of buying them?
With the exception of Thomas Hodgson in Penrith and Rock Brothers as publishers, nothing I've seen connected with them suggests what could I call the core, the main book trade. Where there's a local advert in them, or where the publishers have been tracked down through directories, they are almost invariably fancy stationers rather than stationers as we would tend to use the phrase. One of the volumes I've seen has got a bookseller's stamp in it, but it's later on into the 20th century, and so, you know, it's on the second-hand market by then. I think they were fancy goods, not books in the way we use the term. Superseded, of course, by the picture postcard.
But although they're not books, they're not quite ephemera either. They fall between two stools, don't they?
Yeah.
So do you get a sense of how much of these things have survived?
Well, I think I can't remember the exact figures now, but out of 150, 100 and whatever it was of Charles Reynolds' publications, 50 something had survived. 50 something I've located, either on Library Hub or that. They don't seem to have survived in great numbers.
No.
And there are the 2 main collections I know of are at the Kyoto, where I mentioned, and in the Library of Congress, they have a collection of American ones, which they haven't catalogued separately. They just call them the Glacier and Frey collection. And Pentagram just recently published a very nice little booklet about them, mainly drawn on an American collection, but it doesn't say where the collection is now housed. But a number of the American ones were for publicity purposes of towns rather than to attract tourists. They were very good investment.
That's interesting. I've just happened to read an article in preparation for this about Glaser prints and about Louis Glaser. Is it Louis?
Louis.
Yeah. And it was in some postcard journal.
Yeah.
And it was an American writing in Europe and was saying that they are more plentiful in the US and he can barely find any in Europe. And it's curious as to why they would have survived in the US in slightly larger numbers than they have in Europe.
Yes, it's an interesting point. An ABE search breaks down a few in Europe, a fair number in England, and a large number in America. some of them, in my opinion, hideously overpriced.
They usually are.
I speak there as a collector.
Another question in the Q&A, I think this time for both of you. Can you both give any advice on how to recognize in an image when these lithographic processes have been used? Which of you wishes to take that one?
I would recommend you, when it comes to recognizing processes, I would recommend Bamba Gascoigne's How to Identify a Print. How the devil you tell the difference between a stone lithograph and a zinc lithograph, I don't know. That I think Cătălina would have more idea than I.
Well, yeah, I'm not sure if I have a definite answer to that. I think with a stone lithograph, you could see if the print isn't trimmed, an impression where the stone might have ended, and usually they have kind of rounded corners. But a lot of lithographs from this period are actually, for example, Barnett Friedman, he only drew on stone. And so his lithographs are often transferred to zinc plates for the actual printing. So in terms of the material used for printing, I think it's, yeah, I don't know, there's probably one person in the world who could make that distinction, and that's Michael Twyman.
Yes. But we'll refer that question to Michael.
Yeah, but the interesting thing is why I kind of smiled at this question is if the question is how can you tell that something has been auto-lithographed, that the answer to that is that you have to take their word for it. And this was my my discussion around the big billboards, because when we found the prints, it was penciled in a corner, I assume by Mosley, that this was autolithography. But then, yeah, we showed them to Michael, and he gave a long list of like, surely that's not autolithography, it would be pointless. And then I found this letter in which Mosley actually says, no, I've done it. So, but I'm not sure whose word to take. So yeah, unless you're able to find the original painting or whatever, the original artwork, and then notice that the lithograph replicates that perfectly, that's when you can conclude that, okay, this was not auto-lithographed, this was a chromolithographer translating this image onto the stones. Whereas when an artist drew, they took the liberty to change their sketch. It was never really planned this way. So it's a little bit of working backwards to trace, if you're lucky, to find that out. Yeah.
Beautifully handled, Cătălina. Thank you.
Question from Liz Woodham. Could I ask Barry his thoughts on how similar the covers are, red, gold embossed, to English Lake District guidebooks of the same period? Is this significant or not?
Hi, Liz. Good question. No, I don't think there is any great significance in it, except possibly the small oblong ones, of which there are 3 or 4 of the lakes, a couple on Keswick, even Carlisle, later, a Carlisle publication of Cumberland in general. But they are pocket-sized in the sense that they are almost exactly the same size as the Nelson guidebooks, which were published nationally. There is a tendency in Victorian book design to over-elaborate, to make something as attractive as possible. Paper onlays, different colored papers, gilding, or gold blocking rather than gilding. So I think they stand on their own right. You don't normally see guidebooks with quite the ornate elaboration that you see, for instance, on the Charles Reynolds albums, the third one I showed. yeah, I think they are almost unique. No, you can't be almost unique. I think they're uncommon other than on this sort of souvenir album.
Okay, thank you, Barry. Cătălina, just a question out of curiosity here. You've spoken about Mosley's work using autolithography for the reproduction of posters on paper. Does his work appear in other surfaces, like transfer printing for ceramics, for example, as Borden and Revillis's work gets used that way?
Mosley's work?
Yeah.
Well, as far as I know, he's mostly worked for printing on paper. Trying to think. Yeah, I don't think we've ever come across of his work being printed on any other sort of surface. He did autolithography for, besides posters, for books, for book illustrations. But I don't think I could.
And within the archive that you've got, how much correspondence is there?
Well, my whole talk was actually drawing on one letter. So I would say that I think the archive that came to Reading probably has 2 letters. I did find a very well documented correspondence of the limited editions club, for which Mosley produced 4 books, and one was in working but never got published. And they have the archive at the University of Texas. And because of the lockdown, they were very kind to scan all of these letters for me. And yeah, Mosley wasn't a great letter writer. He didn't like to. And I could see that because people were frustrated at him just phoning them, or like just showing up in places rather than corresponding like people used to back in the day. So I don't have really, I'm very much relying on the pictures that I see to make sense of it all.
You're piecing together a very good story with limited primary evidence therefore, other than the images. It's making a very comprehensive story. There's a comment in the Q&A from Nicholas Birchall. The guidebook covers remind me of sheet music covers.
Yeah, I'm not terribly familiar with sheet music covers, other than the boring, bland things you get now. The only Victorian ones I've ever seen are usually ornate lithograph views, lithograph pictures of dancing couples or cheerful whatever have yous. I don't think I've seen any, but I think bound volumes of music, yes, they're I've seen those that are ornately blocked. But yes, it's an interesting. I mean, it's probably a stylistic thing. Victorians couldn't see anything without smothering it in ornament, could they? Sorry, such cynicism in one so young.
Well, it's 1825. Does anyone have any final questions for our 2 speakers this evening? Any other burning questions that you've got before we call it a day? In which case, I will thank both Cătălina and Barry for their excellent talks. They were both thoroughly enjoyable and very informative. And to remind you that the next HoPIN seminar will be on the 19th of May. You will get notification of that if you're a member of the HoPIN mailing list, or if you're a member of CPHC mailing list, you'll also get notification of it that way. So it leaves me nothing else to say other than to wish you a good evening. I hope you all go off and have a pint of Guinness or a whiskey in commemoration of St. Patrick's Day. And see you in May. Thank you.
Thank you.